All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning into the Angst Podcast. My name is Jericho. I am your host. And for today's discussion, I wanted to go over the topic of the awareness state of consciousness. That kind of sober state, that ego-driven reality that we kind of function in our day-to-day existence. And to do so, I thought I would start the topic by actually rewinding the clock and telling you guys about a couple of experiences and lessons that happened to me kind of at the beginning of this year. In January 2019, my girlfriend and I had decided to take on something called an elimination diet. It's kind of similar to like a Whole30 diet if you're familiar with that. Essentially, the idea is that you eliminate foods that have been deemed to be somewhat intolerant or allergenic for a large percentage of the population. And so the list for us at least consisted of gluten, dairy, alcohol, no caffeine, no processed sugar, no artificial sweeteners, no nightshade vegetables. It was kind of an extensive list, and it was extensive enough that it kind of limited us to only being able to consume food that we had either purchased and cooked and prepared in the home. It made it very difficult to kind of eat out on the go and not be able to see ingredients list or know how things were made. And so it was very interesting. I'm happy that we did it because I gained a little bit of insight into my own body, my own microbiome, and my own dietary needs and restrictions. And I didn't do it necessarily because I thought I had like a major allergy that needed a problem. I did it literally just to kind of prove that I could. Realistically, that's the healthiest I've eaten in my entire life. Those kind of 40 to 50 days in there was that was the most committed I had been to my diet in my entire 25 years. And honestly, I also was a little bit curious just to see if there was anything that I had an intolerance to. A lot of people kind of walk around assuming that they don't have intolerances or any allergies to anything. And the problem is that you never really know if you haven't done an extensive test or if the allergy or the intolerance was significant enough to actually show up in your lifestyle in some way. And so what do I mean by that is if you're somebody that had, a potential intolerance to eggs, and so you're not hypoallergenic, you're not going to go into a state of chaos or anything like that when you consume them. Maybe you just get a little bit of diarrhea, a little upset stomach, a headache, it's hard to say. But if you're somebody that's grown up eating eggs and you've been eating muffins and baked goods and things that contain eggs in it, and realistically you never really go, 48, 72 hours without consuming something that has an egg product in it, then you might not even really know that you have a bit of intolerance. And so even though your heart rate kind of gets jacked up, you have a hard time processing it, your shits might not be of the quality that we would normally be looking for, you just continuously consume eggs and it's never really even come into your thought that there might be a problem there. And so I thought there'd be some valuable information. If I was going to find something, there's some easy metrics you can use. Obviously, you can use subjective ones like just how do I feel? How am I sleeping? What kind of weight am I moving in the gym? What does my poop look like? Kind of those self-analytical metrics. But there's also some more scientific data points that you could reference as well. Something like your heart rate. You could take your resting heart rate before and after consuming the item. And, if there is an increase in your heart rate after, 30 minutes or so of eating whatever that ingredient may have been, that could be a sign that you're having a little bit of a more difficult time processing those nutrients, and that could lead to an intolerance. And so essentially what happens is, for 30 days, we eliminate all of these items out of our diet. We eat super, super clean. And then independently, one at a time, we bring these variables back in, test them, kind of gauge how we feel, take them back out, bring a new variable back in. And it's just a nice little test, a little bit of mental fortitude to prove that we could, and then a little bit of data just to see ongoing kind of what our diet might have to consist of. Not that anybody cares, but corn for me was a little bit of a fucker. Doesn't matter if it's corn on the cob, corn syrup, popcorn, it doesn't matter. It just leaves me with like a heavy, hollow pit in my stomach. It's a very odd feeling. I don't like it whatsoever. So fuck corn. But yeah, so why do I bring that up is, for about 45 days there, I was eating super clean. I was feeling very good. I was feeling very nutritiously dense. Again, I don't think I've eaten this healthy or been that dedicated to my nutrition and my diet in almost my entire life, at least not that strictly for that long. And then, unfortunately, coming into February, we had a little bit of a turn of events where we had received some bad news. My girlfriend's mom had been going through cancer treatments, a little bit of chemotherapy and radiation, and she had actually taken a turn for the worst. And so we had decided to actually mobilize a couple hours north, leaving our city and traveling to where she was getting treatments to just be with her and support her through this time. And so it was kind of this crazy juxtaposition of, working a job that I was comfortable with and I knew, sleeping in our own bed, eating very well, eating home cooked food all the time, and then, kind of living out of friends and family's houses, pull-out couches, having to sleep at the hospital, eating out of takeaway containers, eating hospital food. And it was just this total contrast to the previous 45 days that I was, kind of firing on all cylinders and living like a high energy, nutriently dense lifestyle. And so that gave me a little bit of interesting data from going to the super high point to kind of what I would consider to be like a lower point, where all of a sudden I noticed kind of personality changes in myself, and I was a little more irritable and I was a little more stressed. And that wasn't just the food or the diet, quite clearly. We were also concerned about my girlfriend's mother and the current state that she was in, and just the whole environment. For anybody that's had to spend extended periods of times in a hospital, it's just not the most inviting and calming place in general. So I'm definitely going to give credit where credit is due as far as the stress and the external factors there as well. But why do I bring all this up? Well, to link it back to today's discussion and topic and kind of that sober state of consciousness, it was very interesting to me to kind of determine what external factors could potentially be influencing me, Jericho, my consciousness and my personality and just my thoughts. And so as we were going through this time, I actually also took up the practice of meditation. I was stressed enough throughout the days. We had a lot of kind of downtime at the hospital, and I had decided to kind of download an application, go through some sessions, and it kind of became a daily routine and practice and goal that I had set for myself. And so when we can kind of combine all of this data, I really started to notice kind of the weird little expressions and the nuances of my consciousness and my thoughts, and just how easily manipulated they were by the outside environment. If I was to take in a food that was a little bit more processed, that, maybe I did have an intolerance towards something like corn, and then over the next couple of hours, I could notice myself being sluggish and tired. I could feel irritable, more short-tempered. I was less likely to strike up conversations or be friendly towards, my peers or strangers. And in the meditation, it was very interesting because I could kind of feel these changes in these thoughts, not necessarily as the regular day-to-day experiences, that internal ego narrative that we normally have kind of running through our brain all the time, but more so as kind of wavelengths and pattern of energy. And I could feel that I would have these initial impulses where I would have tension in my back, or maybe, my lower back would be a little tight, or my hips would be a little tight, or I'd have an itch or something irritable. And all of a sudden in these meditative moments when I'm supposed to be calm and relaxed and kind of just letting stimulus flow through, they would have so much power over me. Like that aching back would become like a very prominent thought. And then from that thought, I would run down a pattern of other somewhat negative or irritable thoughts. And so it would start with, oh, my back's a little sore. And then it would translate into, I'm spending too much money this month, or I'm stressed about my career path in this direction. And it was crazy where in a moment where I'm supposed to be calm and relaxing, I would run down these crazy kind of, almost shit-talking narratives. And then I'd catch myself and I'd take a full breath and I'd kind of bring back in, I'd focus on something positive. And that's kind of the practice of meditation, is acknowledging the stimulus as these patterns of energy and kind of understanding emotions as indicators, not as like direction, or like, maybe direction is not the right word, but not as necessary truths, but more just potential indicators of how you should react or behave. And so to kind of, again, to tie this into today's discussion, what I think I've been noticing, at least in myself, but as well as our society, our culture, and the peers that I surround myself with, is a lot of people in their day-to-day reality, they associate so deeply with that internal voice. That internal voice seems like them. They're kind of running the show. Their thoughts lead them in the direction that they need to go. And they kind of take it as like this gospel truth of, if the voice has something to say, we should probably listen to it and run in that direction. But there's so many external stimuli that's constantly manipulating your thoughts literally all the time. Whether it is that kind of processed bad food diet that you've been rocking for the last couple of years, whether it is that back pain or that elbow pain that you've been that's been nagging and irritable for the last couple of weeks. And all of these little things can create energy in your body and tension in your body that you start to hold. And that tension will actually translate into the little narration and that internal voice that's inside your head. And so I think for a lot of people, they resonate with that voice saying, no, I'm the thinker of my thoughts. I'm a free will conscious creature, and I'm kind of running steering the ship, and I have my hands on the reins. But there's so many subconscious and external factors that are constantly kind of creating this reality for you. And a lot of the time, what's interesting about about reality is some people, especially individuals that have functioned in their sober consciousness state the whole time. So let's say you're somebody that has never, maybe you've never really meditated. Maybe you've never had a hallucination of any kind. You've never been hypnotized. You've never taken psychedelic substances. Maybe you haven't messed around with alcohol or drugs of any kind. Then you're somebody that probably has what they deem to be a firm grasp on reality. And so your day-to-day existence, you're functioning in what we would consider to be the real world. And then if somebody is, being hypnotized, or if they've taken a large dose of acid or mescaline or psilocybin, then those individuals are tripping on drugs and they're experiencing, hallucinations and kind of false stimulus is coming into their system. But I'm here to kind of make an argument that I actually think that that's not the case. And with this juxtaposition of lifestyle that I saw with my meditation practice, with my own experiences with drugs, what I've kind of concluded is that the brain is very, very good at protecting you and filtering out background noise and unnecessary information. And it's gotten very, very good at this through thousands of years of evolution. And so what's happened is that we've developed these senses, and there's, humans happen to have 5 main ones. And so whether it's sight or smell or touch or hearing, we create this reality that surrounds us. And essentially what your brain is doing is it's giving you its best guesstimate as to what the external world is. And so hypothetically speaking, when I look at a series of lights and shadows and colors, my eyes and my brain do a very good job of creating this reality, which is essentially a hallucination. My eyes are just taking in stimulus, communicating with my brain, and together they're combining the other stimulus that they have, whether it's hearing or touch or whatever it may be, and they're kind of creating this real-time picture of our reality. But what's interesting is we already know that that can be manipulated and tricked. Like, I'm sure you have looked at a optical illusion online or some piece of paper or screen, and maybe they have a couple of lines and it says, which line's the smallest, but they're actually all the same, because all it's doing is it has a couple of arrows that are manipulating the size and it's confusing your brain. Or maybe some of the, it could be a series of dots that when you look at it, the dots appear to be spinning in some type of vortex, even though they're actually still. Then this is a classic optical illusion where we're essentially just tricking one of your senses. And then your brain perceives it a certain way and creates the reality it wants. But it's not real, but you know that because you know you're looking at an optical illusion. But how often throughout your day-to-day experience are you getting tricked in some way, shape, or form, but you don't know it's an optical illusion, or you don't know that the trick is actually occurring? I feel like it's actually happening all the time. And to go back to the food and the diet thing, for example, you are made up of a microbiome of literally billions of externalized bacteria. There is more bacteria in your microbiome, individual pieces of bacteria, than there are individual cells in your entire body. So another way of looking at that is there's actually more foreign entities that make up you and are inside you than there is like native you cells, or like your own kind of like DNA expression, which is a crazy thought. Like, it's a mind-blowing stoner thought to think that there's more foreign bodies than there are native bodies. And so when you consume these substances, and you've been spending years potentially consuming like not so good ones, high inflammatory ones, things that might have not been properly processed, might have been sitting in the danger zone, have developed improper bacteria, viruses, parasites, who the fuck knows what, and you've absorbed that in throughout decades of existing, what kind of manipulation do they have on your psyche? What kind of optical illusion are they running in your system internally? I've been reading a book. It's by an author named Annika Harris. It's called Consciousness. And she actually brings up a couple of interesting studies. I'm going to blank on the name of the individual that ran these studies, but they were with split brain patients. And so there was a couple of individuals that were suffering from epileptic seizures, and to prevent the seizures from spreading throughout the brain, these surgeons actually cut the brain right into 2 hemispheres. I think it's called the corpus callosum, something like that. I'm not up to date with my brain anatomy, so my apologies, everybody. But they essentially cut the center nerve, splitting the brain into the 2 hemispheres. Roughly speaking, the right hemisphere is involved with a lot of control on the left-hand side of the body, and the left brain hemisphere is involved with a lot of control on the right-hand side of the body. And so throughout these tests, they had different stimuli that they would project to these individuals that had that center nerve cut, and they would only project the stimulus to one side. So maybe they would cover one of their eyes, they'd only have their left eye seeing the stimulus, and so it'd only be projecting to the right hand side of the brain. And it was interesting because in these studies what would happen is they would ask they would only show certain stimulus to one side of the body. And then when they asked the individuals to relay the information, hey, what did you just see? They physically couldn't answer. So for example, let's say there was a pair of keys on the table. And so they would cover their left eye. They could only see the keys with their right eye on the table. They would, show them a couple of different objects, and then they would pull the screen up and they would say, okay, can you tell us what object you saw most recently? And the individuals couldn't say it. And the reason being is because in the left-hand side of the brain, in the left hemisphere, that's kind of involved with language processing, it never got the stimulus that it needed. That part of the body was covered up, and so it didn't see what it needed to see to then say and speak, oh, I saw a set of keys, for example. But if then asked to point, if there was a series of objects on the table or a series of photos of the objects, to ask to be pointed to what object they just saw, they could physically point in the direction because the part of the brain that handles a lot of motor function did see the object. So the left hand or the left eye communicated to the right hemisphere, which is involved in a lot of motor processing, and that could point at the object and say, this is what we saw. And so that's a very interesting way of the brain communicating. And even though you received the stimulus, and this is an extreme example, it's hard to say within a healthy individual what parts of the brain are communicating to what parts and how that information gets processed and then regurgitated back out into thoughts or memories or stories or whatever it may be. Another example that was kind of up in the news recently, there's a mass shooting, it seems like every couple of weeks in America, and it's super sad, and I'm not going to dive into it in today's podcast, but it was interesting because in New York, in Times Square a couple weeks ago, there was a motorcycle that engine backfired, and everybody went into utter chaos. People started running around, basically thinking that there was a mass shooter, that shots were being fired, and everybody went sprinting for the hills. And what's interesting about that is this is kind of an optical illusion being played on your brain, where there's a part of your brain that understands that you did not hear a gunshot. Right? Like what you heard was an engine backfiring, and there is a subtle difference there. But the problem is with all the hysteria and the media coverage and all the recent mass shootings, with that in the forefront of our consciousness and our memory, it's easy to hear something that sounds like a gunshot and immediately associate it with another mass shooting. If mass shootings had never happened, if we had never had a situation where somebody walked into a public environment and started just opening fire, that sound easily to all of those people could have just sounded like a car backfiring, because that would have been the most logical thing for the brain to conclude based off of the information that it has and the experiences of the individual growing up. And this is how we all function. Our brains are very good at telling us stories about how the world works, and we have our experiences and our memories to kind of carry us through so that going forward we can be more efficient, we can be safer, we can be quicker. And it's very interesting to see the variances within human beings because, my experiences aren't the same as yours. And so when I receive certain stimulus and you receive certain stimulus, it's not going to be the same. Like, let's say, for example, tonight, after you listen to this podcast, you go to bed, you fall soundly asleep, and you wake up in a bit of a daze. And at the edge of your bed, there is a bright white light with a kind of a silhouette figure. You can't tell if it seems to be a person standing there, but you can't really see any distinguishable features. You can't tell if it's a man or a woman. It's just blindingly bright. If that is all of your experience and then you end up passing back asleep and that's it, that's all you remember, and you wake up in the morning with this thought of, oh, there was this figure at the edge of my bed, well, there's a couple different thoughts that could happen here. One, a rational materialist could chalk it up to being a dream, a hallucination, a false memory. It wasn't real, they just imagined it, and that could be the case. A second individual, let's say they were one of a religious and a faith background, they could view that as a guardian angel or God or Jesus, or maybe a loved one that had recently passed away that's come to visit them in the night. Somebody that is obsessed with aliens and recently watched Bob Lazar's Area 51 documentary on Netflix might think that was an alien coming to probe them, and maybe they got blasted up into a spaceship last night and examined by some extraterrestrial being. I mean, that's an example of your imagination and your brain trying to problem solve based off of its experiences, its beliefs of the world, and then kind of taking in the stimulus that it has and presenting a conclusion or a story to you. In my opinion, what I think has happened with consciousness is that we've evolved throughout hundreds of thousands of years to filter out all the mechanisms of reality. I think reality is beautifully complex to the point of absolutely overwhelming. And if you were actually to function in that state all the time, it would be show-stopping. You wouldn't be able to get anything done. You wouldn't be a very productive human being. Instead, you need to filter out the background noise and the stuff that's not important. And your senses do a very good job of doing this. When you take a psychedelic substance like mescaline or like psilocybin, for example, what I believe to be happening and what I think I can actually start to validate with some scientific research and backup would be that there are parts of the brain that are normally not connecting and are not firing with the same synapses that get all of a sudden this new open connection and are now able to communicate back and forth that normally would never be able to talk to one another. So all of a sudden colors become more vibrant and time slows down and all of these crazy concepts, your internal regular ego also gets suppressed. In mescaline, for example, what mescaline actually does is it reduces an enzyme that normally allows for glucose to be released and secreted into the brain. It temporarily eliminates that enzyme. So once that enzyme is gone, the blood glucose level in the brain actually drops and it pulls from parts of the brain that are actually responsible for that internal dialogue and your ego. And so after you've lost those sugar and glucose levels, you actually lower your capabilities and the ego runs out of energy. And so essentially what it says is, you know what? We don't have time to be concerned with all the normal stuff that we're concerned with. We're running on first gear right here. And instead of having this ego-driven reality of your own experiences and all of your own beliefs and biases and storytelling, normally interpreting the stimulus and the data around you, that gets lowered down to zero. And instead, all of the stimulus comes in like a flourishing bright light of new knowledge and data, because for the first time, it's not being filtered out in that regular experience that we have in our day-to-day existence. I think this is what happens with children all the time. I think that's why kids are more afraid of the dark. I think this is why kids have overactive imaginations, imaginary friends. I think this is why kids can be very creative and expressive, is because they haven't built up these parameters and expectations of how the world is or how it should be or what they've learned it to be. They're just getting raw data in for the first time, and their brain doesn't have rules or expectations, so it can just run with the data. And so I think it can be a very silly sounding comparison, but I genuinely do believe that children are, for lack of a better term, kind of tripping on drugs. Like their brain hasn't solidified this strong, concrete ego adulthood like lifestyle that most of us are functioning and living with now. And so they're this, recent God incarnation that is open to new experiences of the universe, the same way that somebody tripping on psychedelics is, because they've lost that regular adult narrative that normally runs the show and has the reins of their reality. And so why am I rambling this way? Why do I think this is all important? Is I believe that there is inherent value in occasionally dipping your toe into these altered states of consciousness. I believe that most people are functioning in their day-to-day reality in this sober, ego-driven state. And that's okay, because the ego does a lot for us. It keeps us safe and protected. It allows us to advance in society. It allows us to make smart decisions about our experiences and our reality and the physical plane that we have a physical body and reside in. And that's good, like 99.9% of the time, so that you can pay your bills, pick up the kids, have social relationships, and actually have an intrinsic desire to do better and self-improve and to care for yourself and stay alive. The ego serves a very prominent role in our existence. But I do believe that there is inherent value in every once in a while allowing that ego to be pushed to the side, and then just opening yourself, letting go, and letting yourself take in the reality for not what you think it is, but for how it actually might be. And everybody's so confident that has never meditated, that's never done drugs, that they know what's real and that they're functioning in the real state and that their brain is super efficient and perfect at absorbing all the stimuli of their reality, and that this has to be what it is. But again, guys, at the end of the day, it's only you're a certain individual growing up in this year. You're a human being, so this is how the world looks to you. If you were a different animal, like, if you were a bat, there's a very famous essay about consciousness. I think it's titled "What It's Like to Be a Bat" or something along those lines. And if you were a bat maneuvering through the dark, flying through the air via echolocation, I imagine that your consciousness and your reality would be infinitely different. But it wouldn't be any less real than what our human sober state reality is. Real is subjective because, again, at the end of the day, your brain is doing a very good job of taking in stimuli and converting it into this hologram that we call life. And so to kind of close up here, guys, there's kind of two ways that I have about looking at it. I'm a big proponent of kind of entering out of this regular sober state and occasionally dipping your toe in the water of an altered state of consciousness. I think there's a lot of data and inherent value to kind of interact with how the world might actually be instead of just these preconceived, locked in notions that we have about it. And it doesn't necessarily need to be drugs. I've touched on it already, but I think meditation is a perfectly natural and a very good starting point to kind of feel what it might be like to let that ego relax and to just take stimulus for what it is, which is energy and patterns and waves, and to not allow your emotions to drag you in different directions, but to be able to actually feel them, process them, and then act responsibly and accordingly. I think meditation is a great way to kind of dip your toe into the water and get started. But there's two ways that I look at it, guys. One, either you are a person of religious faith, you believe that there is a higher power, and if that is the case, that then there's likely some type of reincarnation or afterlife or transition into a higher state of consciousness when we die. And if that's the case, I view entering into these altered states of consciousness as a necessary training module to better prepare you for whatever that process might be in the afterlife. And so if you've been able to feel what it is to be almost less human, to not be restricted to all the preconceived notions of the human brain, and to open yourself up to a more connected and larger energy source, a larger consciousness, then that's fantastic training. To go into these psychedelic or meditative states, it's a great opportunity to maybe kind of harness your own skills and your own energy and see maybe what it would be like to transition into a new existence or into a higher consciousness or into the afterlife. And then if you're somebody that isn't of that belief structure, if you're not a person of faith or religion, if you don't believe in a higher power, if you don't believe in an afterlife, then I mean, you kind of got one shot here, right? You've got 70, 80 years, 90 at best, and you're going to spend the whole time not experimenting with anything that actually is, creative or unique or different or expressive. Like I've always respected when people say they live a good, happy life and they don't feel the need to pursue in those directions of, using psychedelics or altering their state of consciousness. And if that is the case, totally fine. I would recommend sticking with the meditative aspect. That's a way to at least manipulate it, and it's 100% homeopathic and natural, and that's totally fine. But I just kind of feel like in your limited existence here, if this is all it is and the lights are going to shut out, what's the harm in one day out of the tens of thousands of days of your existence that you decide to enter into an altered state just to see? Take it from me, like I know we probably don't know each other. I know I'm this guy on the internet you can't necessarily just take for face value and trust. But I've had very positive experiences with some of these psychedelic substances. I've quality controlled them. I've got them from a good source. The set and setting has been pristine in my opinion, and I've been very careful and respectful as to when I've indulged into these experiences. But I've found them to be highly educative, highly of a high value in my life and some of the more important days of my existence, because they've changed my entire understanding of what this world is and what is real and reality. And I want to share some of these details with you guys. I'm on my own journey. You guys are on yours. Please converse back with me. Let me know if you agree or disagree, if there's any cool points about consciousness that I maybe missed. And I really appreciate you tuning in. We will see you next time.